Along with pilgrimage, the second great influence on Romanesque art and architecture was monasticism.
The monastic ideal had long been a spiritual goal of humankind, from the farthest reaches of Ireland to the high Himalaya. But Western monasticism only really began after the fall of the Roman Empire in response to the collapse of political power. Self-contained, self-sufficient communities cut off from the world. The most famous order, the Benedictine, was founded by Saint Benedict in the 6th century. His great rule, poverty, chastity, and obedience, insisted on a life devoted to manual labor, devoted to prayer and to the copying and interpretation of the sacred texts.
Decorating these books was an act of devotion. During the Middle Ages, sumptuous manuscript illuminations were the most important form of painting in Western art.
By 1100, endowed with massive grants of land from kings and nobles, the great orders, the Benedictine, the Cluniac, the Cistercian, held virtual monastic empires across Europe, powerful patrons of art and architecture.
This beautiful building is the Priory Church of Paray-le-Monial. It is in fact a perfect example of Cluniac Romanesque architecture at the height of its powers. Where does the term Romanesque come from? Like many other widely used words in the history of art, like Impressionism or Gothic, Romanesque began its life as a derogatory term. Historians in the early 19th century thought that the massive pillars and great vaults of Romanesque buildings looked rather like a debased form of Roman architecture, and so they called it Romanesco, or Romanesque. In fact, the term couldn't be more apt. For early medieval patrons and architects were constantly looking back to the glories of the classical Roman past, trying to build in the classical language of architecture in Christian form. But to 4th century Christians, it was a practical matter. Needing places of worship, they took over the long Roman basilica, which became the standard form for Christian architects in the West. Gradually, over the centuries, these architects transformed the Roman form. They first added a great transept to it, thus making the church into a symbolic cross shape. At the west end of the building, they added towers, breaking up the horizontal silhouette of the basilica with vertical forms. At the east end, they retained the Roman apse, but made choirs more sophisticated with radiating chapels. And inside the building, they broke up the simple walls of the Roman basilica with openings for the galleries and for the windows. And instead of the flat wooden roofs of the early basilicas, they used Roman-style vaults.
Votre amour soit pour les hommes, pour vos parents et vos amis, un signe de l'amour de Dieu. Veuillez échanger vos consentements.
Pascal, veux-tu être
Oui?
In the Middle Ages, Paray-le-Monial would never have been used for weddings, but nevertheless, the Cluniac monks did encourage a large lay congregation. But this church is not just a superb example of monastic architecture. It's a model by which we can understand the whole of high Romanesque architecture in France. As a pilgrim or a member of the lay congregation, we would have entered this building through a porch and found ourselves in the wide and splendid nave, either in the central aisle, where I'm standing, or in the wide side aisles.
we would have moved up the church to the crossing behind me, so called because it's here that the nave of the church crosses with those side spaces called the transepts, and beyond them, the most holy part of the church, with the choir, the high altar, behind which the most important relics were displayed, and beyond the altar, the curving ambulatory with the chapels radiating off it.
Hundreds of pilgrims crowding into the church were dangerous and noisy. And so the medieval architect evolved this superb corridor around the high altar, which we call an ambulatory. This solved perfectly what one scholar has called the traffic problem of the medieval pilgrimage. But perhaps most distinctive of high Romanesque architecture here is the great tunnel or barrel vault above my head. Almost every great church in France from the 11th century onwards had these stone vaults, and for very good reasons. Until then, most churches had simple timber roofs over them. And as you can imagine, in buildings that were lit largely with candles, this was a terrible fire hazard. But there were other advantages in these great vaults as well. They were visually beautiful, they were acoustically marvelous. The Cluniacs spent most of their day here in the choir chanting the divine services, and their Gregorian chants would be taken by these barrel vaults upwards and dispersed through the whole church. So, stone vaults were very much needed in Romanesque architecture in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. But they posed considerable problems for architects then. They had no scientific knowledge of engineering. They also had very primitive equipment, simple wooden cranes and simple scaffolding. There were bound to be failures. Vaults often collapsed in the Middle Ages. If a Romanesque architect wished, however, to find a good model for large stone vaulting, he could do no better than to look at the well-preserved examples of Roman vaulting, which he could have found in the south of France or all around him, here in Burgundy.
Less than a mile from this Roman gate in the nearby town of Autun stands Autun Cathedral. Like Paray-le-Monial, the cathedral is a perfect example of the influence of classical Roman architecture on the Romanesque architect. We can see the classical forms everywhere here. The fluted pilasters crowned at the top by Corinthian capitals. And in the middle story of the building, this characteristic composition of round arches separated by flat pilasters and closed by a horizontal cornice. These forms come straight from the local Roman precedent here in Autun, the Porte d'Arroux.